Putin just turned off gas and in doing so triggered a shock the United States and Europe were never prepared to absorb. This was not an energy dispute or a temporary cutoff, but a strategic move that pushed the US and Europe toward a new dark age defined by scarcity, instability, and collapsing industrial power. Within hours, the foundations of modern Western life began to strain under pressures no alliance or emergency meeting could reverse. What you are watching is not a crisis that will pass, but the opening phase of a long decline driven by energy as a weapon. At precisely the moment when modern Western leaders believed energy interdependence had neutralized old-style power politics, Vladimir Putin demonstrated that assumption was not just wrong, but catastrophically naive. When Russia shut off gas flows, this was not merely an attack on Europe's heating systems or industrial supply chains. It was a strategic strike on the entire Atlantic world, including the United States, whose global power position depends far more on European stability than most Americans realize. Energy is not simply a commodity. It is the invisible scaffolding of modern civilization. Remove it, and everything else follows. The mistake many analysts make is treating energy disruptions as temporary economic shocks rather than structural geopolitical events. What we are witnessing is not a price spike or a negotiation tactic. It is the deliberate dismantling of the energy foundations that allowed the United States and Europe to dominate the global system for 3/4 of a century. I have spent my career studying how great powers exploit dependency, and this moment fits a classic pattern that Western policymakers consistently refuse to acknowledge. Power does not come from ideals, alliances, or even military hardware alone. Power comes from control over the basic inputs that make modern life possible. Gas is one of those inputs, and its removal initiates a cascade that no sanctions package, no emergency summit, and no rhetorical commitment to unity can reverse. Europe is the most obvious casualty, but the United States is not standing on safe ground. The Atlantic system functions as an integrated whole. When Europe's industrial base collapses, American economic, military, and diplomatic leverage collapses with it. The gas cutoff exposed a truth that Washington has avoided confronting for decades. The United States cannot maintain global leadership without a prosperous, industrially capable Europe, and Europe cannot sustain industrial civilization without secure, affordable energy. That relationship is not ideological, it is mechanical. When gas disappears, factories stop. When factories stop, employment collapses. When employment collapses, political legitimacy erodes. This chain reaction is already underway. European governments speak of resilience, but resilience is a comforting word used when hard power options are exhausted. The physical reality is far less forgiving. Chemical plants cannot operate on speeches. Steel mills cannot be powered by diplomatic communiques. Data centers, hospitals, transportation networks, and military production lines all require continuous energy input. Once that input is severed, decline is not gradual, it is abrupt. What makes this moment different from previous energy crises is not simply scale, but intent. This is not an accidental shortage or a weather-driven disruption. It is a conscious strategic decision designed to permanently degrade Western capacity. The Kremlin understands something that Western elites prefer to forget. Economic interdependence does not eliminate conflict. It creates leverage. For decades, Europe believed buying Russian gas was a stabilizing force. In reality, it was an investment in vulnerability. Putin did not need tanks to achieve strategic effects that generations of Soviet planners failed to secure through military confrontation. He needed only to wait until dependency reached a critical threshold. That threshold has now been crossed. The immediate effects dominate headlines, but the deeper consequences are far more dangerous. Europe is entering a phase where maintaining basic living standards competes directly with sustaining global influence. Heating homes versus funding militaries. keeping hospitals running versus underwriting alliance commitments. These are not theoretical trade-offs, they are budgetary realities imposed by energy scarcity. The United States faces a parallel dilemma, though it is less visible to the average American. U.S. power is global because it rests on a dense network of allies, markets, and financial systems centered on Europe. When European economies shrink, demand for American exports falls. When European currencies weaken, dollar instability grows. When European governments lose legitimacy, alliance cohesion fractures. This is how systemic decline unfolds, not through dramatic collapse, but through accumulating constraints that narrow strategic options. Washington can send liquefied natural gas, but LNG is not a substitute for pipeline gas at civilizational scale. The infrastructure does not exist to replace hundreds of millions of cubic meters per day, and even if it did, the cost structure would hollow out European industry. Deindustrialization is not a temporary adjustment. Once factories close and skilled labor disperses, competitive capacity does not simply return. The United States learned this lesson in its own industrial decline. Europe is now learning it under far harsher conditions. The narrative that this crisis strengthens American leadership misunderstands the nature of modern power. A hegemon surrounded by weak allies is not stronger, it is isolated. It bears more burdens, not fewer. Energy scarcity in Europe forces the United States into an impossible position. Either it subsidizes European survival indefinitely, draining its own resources, or it accepts a fractured alliance system that can no longer project power globally. Neither outcome preserves American primacy. Putin's decision reveals the asymmetry at the heart of Western strategy. Russia can endure economic pain because it retains control over energy flows and has alternative markets. The United States and Europe, by contrast, have structured their economies around uninterrupted access to cheap energy, while assuming political stability would protect that access. That assumption has failed. The result is not merely colder homes or higher utility bills. It is a reversion to a harsher geopolitical environment where material constraints override political aspirations. The phrase New Dark Age is not hyperbole when applied to societies that lose the energy surplus required to sustain complexity. Modern civilization is energy-intensive by definition. Without surplus energy, societies simplify, institutions weaken, long-term projects are abandoned in favor of short-term survival. This process does not require catastrophe, it requires only sustained scarcity. Europe is already exhibiting these symptoms: emergency energy rationing, industrial shutdowns, social unrest framed not around ideology but survival. The United States is insulated for now, but insulation is not immunity. American prosperity depends on a global system that is unraveling under energy pressure. The strategic brilliance of the gas cutoff lies in its deniability and durability. No missiles were launched, no borders were crossed, yet the effects rival those of major wars. And unlike military campaigns, this form of warfare carries no clear endpoint. Energy once removed is not easily restored. Infrastructure takes years to build. Trust takes decades to rebuild. In the meantime, competitors adapt. China benefits from discounted Russian energy while selling manufactured goods into weakened Western markets. Other energy producers observe and learn. Dependency creates power. Control over essentials outweighs ideological alignment. This lesson will shape international behavior long after this crisis fades from headlines. Western leaders speak of transition, but transitions require stability, capital, and time. Energy scarcity removes all three. The United States and Europe are not plunging into darkness because of technological backwardness. They are doing so because strategic complacency allowed critical dependencies to accumulate unchecked. Putin did not create these vulnerabilities. He exploited them. That distinction matters because it determines whether recovery is possible. Systems built on flawed assumptions rarely survive their exposure. The gas cutoff marks the end of an era in which Western power rested on the belief that economic integration would tame geopolitical rivalry. Instead, it has armed it. The dark age ahead is not medieval in form, but modern in constraint. A world of digital networks constrained by physical scarcity, of advanced weapon systems limited by industrial decay, of political rhetoric outrunning material capacity. That is the future now confronting both Europe and the United States, and it did not arrive by accident. It arrived because power ultimately belongs to those who control the foundations of civilization, not those who merely assume they always will. What ultimately matters in this unfolding crisis is not outrage, morality, or declarations of resolve, but structure. International politics is governed by material realities, and energy sits at the center of those realities in ways Western societies systematically underestimated. The gas cutoff did not simply remove fuel from pipelines, it removed margin from an already strained system. Modern power operates on surplus. Surplus energy allows societies to sustain complexity, to invest in future capabilities, to absorb shocks without breaking. When surplus disappears, choices narrow. Trade-offs become unavoidable. That is the condition now facing both Europe and the United States. Policymakers can deny it, but denial does not heat homes or power factories. The Atlantic world built its post-war dominance on an assumption of permanent energy availability secured by stable political relations. That assumption collapsed the moment energy was weaponized. What follows is not a single crisis, but a sequence of compounding constraints. European governments will attempt mitigation through subsidies, rationing, and emergency coordination, but these measures redistribute scarcity rather than eliminate it. Every euro spent suppressing energy prices is a euro not spent on defense, infrastructure, or innovation. The United States will attempt to compensate through exports and financial support, but doing so accelerates its own fiscal and political exhaustion. This is the classic problem of overextension. A hegemon stretched thin by the weakness of its allies is not reinforced by their dependence. It is burdened by it. Meanwhile, competitors face no such dilemma. Russia retains energy leverage. China acquires discounted inputs. Regional powers observe that coercion through resources carries fewer risks than coercion through arms. The lesson being absorbed globally is simple and dangerous. Control the essentials and you control outcomes. Military power deters invasion. Energy power dictates survival. The Western response has focused heavily on symbolism and unity, but symbols do not replace kilowatt hours. Unity does not substitute for molecules of gas. The structural imbalance remains. Europe's attempt to rapidly transition away from fossil fuels now collides with the reality that transitions require stable baselines. You cannot dismantle one system while another is under construction if energy continuity is broken. The result is regression, not progress. The United States confronts its own version of this truth. Domestic abundance does not insulate a country whose influence depends on external stability. American power rests on open trade routes, functioning allies, credible institutions, and predictable markets. Energy scarcity destabilizes all four. The belief that this crisis strengthens American leverage misunderstands the nature of leadership in an interconnected system. Leadership requires followers capable of acting. Weak partners do not amplify power, they dilute it. As Europe's industrial capacity contracts, so too does the collective West's ability to shape global rules. Sanctions lose force when imposing them inflicts greater damage on the sender than the target. Alliances fracture when members prioritize survival over solidarity. Institutions decay when they can no longer deliver basic outcomes. This is how eras end, not with a single dramatic defeat, but with the quiet accumulation of limits. The new dark age confronting the United States and Europe is not a return to candles and castles, but a return to constraint. A world where advanced societies possess extraordinary technologies but lack the energy foundation to deploy them at scale. A world where ambition outruns capacity. A world where strategy is dictated less by ideals than by access to heat, electricity, and fuel. Putin's decision crystallized this shift with brutal clarity. He demonstrated that economic interdependence does not guarantee peace. It guarantees leverage for those who control choke points. The tragedy for the Atlantic world is that these vulnerabilities were not imposed by an external enemy. They were cultivated internally through decades of policy choices that privileged efficiency over resilience and optimism over realism. The consequences now unfolding are not temporary deviations. They are structural adjustments to a harsher environment. Recovery, if it comes, will be slower, poorer, and more constrained than the past. The global balance of power will reflect that reality. Influence will flow toward those who control resources rather than narratives. Stability will belong to those who can endure scarcity rather than those who assume abundance. The gas cutoff will be remembered not as an energy crisis, but as a strategic inflection point. The moment when the limits of Western power were revealed through something as mundane and essential as heat. In international politics, there are no permanent advantages, only temporary alignments between power and resources. When those alignments break, decline follows. The United States and Europe are now learning that lesson together. The dark age ahead is not inevitable in its depth, but it is unavoidable in its direction unless the foundations of modern power are rebuilt with realism rather than wishful thinking. Energy security is national security. Without it, prosperity, influence, and leadership become illusions sustained only by memory. That is the world now emerging, and it will define international politics long after this winter ends.